there are almost 50 million people who self-identify as black in America, and 91% of them cannot be saved. And what do I mean by saved? Saved from what? Now, people have different ideas as to what it means to be saved and what people need to be saved from, right? So to some people, it means being saved from the hands of the white man, right? And to other people, it may mean being saved from a deity called the devil or Satan, right? And so each one of those are fine, right? For the people who choose to take that approach and to deal with it in that manner. But I'm not talking about either one of those. What I'm talking about is being saved from a number of inherited ideas, beliefs, and habits that are preventing people from making positive progression in their lives, right? And so in other words, people need to be saved from their own selves. And so one of the most destructive ideas that a person needs to be saved from is with the identification of this name black, right? And believing yourself to be a black person, because you have to understand that labeling people who clearly have brown skin as black was one of the greatest destructive psychological strategies that was used by the European colonizers. And so you may ask, what is so destructive about being called black? The answer is that it's a color that is a symbolic representation of all things that are evil and bad in Western thought. So when you accept the identity of black, then those related ideas, they also influence the way other people view you, and more importantly, the way that you view yourself. And so names matter for that very reason. And the meaning of names matter, especially when considering the psychological effect that a name creates. And so colonizers, they are masters of using names as psychological tools to dominate other people, right? That's why whenever they go to places, they rename the cities, they rename the streets, and they rename the people if they get the opportunity to do so. And in the case with the slaves in America, they had that opportunity to do just that, right? They wiped away all the perfectly fine tribal identities that those people had for themselves, and then they gave them the perfectly suitable slave identity of black, right? Which is one of the worst words that you can be called in the English language. But most people don't understand that. But they succeeded in getting them to accept that as a slave name, right? And they have done so good of a job that not many people today have even dared to challenge it. And more importantly, most people today who consider themselves black, they don't even care enough to even consider it, right? That's the wild part about it, which brings us back all the way around to the point that's being made on why it's impossible to save all black people today. And one of the most important lessons that I've learned in life is that all humans don't have the same desires and goals. And this is one thing that really got me to really understand different aspects of life. One thing that matters a great deal to one person could matter very little to the next person, right? And so most blacks, no matter how much history is brought out, no matter how much information is brought out about the name of black and how they inherited it, they could care less about it, right? It doesn't matter to them, and it's not important enough to for them to consider it. And in fact, I've had people on the channel express this very same sentiment, right? They'll understand exactly the points that I'm making, the history that's being brought out, the psychological effects, and they'll still say they don't care. They're still a black person, right? And I have no problem with this at all. Not one bit. Whoever wants to continue being a black person, continue being a black person, right? I think that's perfectly fine for people to make that choice. And I actually think that it's good for people to be honest and upfront about it, because it makes it much easier to distinguish between the 9% who can be saved and the 91% of the blacks who have no chance of being saved today. And so, like I said, the name black, that was forced upon people by the European colonizers, right? For the purpose of doing exactly what colonizers do. And that's colonizing the land and also colonizing the mind, right? And they did a remarkable job at doing this, right? And if you want to know how good of a job they did, just go to the nearest person who identifies themselves as black and then ask that person, why do you identify yourself as black? Why do you call yourself a black person? And then watch what they say. Most of them won't have a clue why they do it, right? And they'll say that they don't know, or they'll say this is just how they grew up. And then you'll understand that most people haven't thought about this in the least bit, right? They've just accepted it. And the colonizers, they knew that this would be the case and the outcome, right? Because they were that good. And that's what you have to understand. And one thing that we have to remember is that one of the objectives for the slave owners in America was to create a group of permanent slaves, right? A permanent class of slave people. So the psychology behind doing this was to get the slaves and the rest of the society to believe that the slaves were less than human. And they accomplished this to a significant degree, right? And I think we all understand this history to some degree, right? And so every person on earth, they have the potential to be self-hating, right? But the slave owners, what they did was they intentionally created an environment to squeeze out this expression of self-hate, right? And to make self-hate a normal part of black consciousness, which is going into that creating a people that's subhuman. And so how this was to look was when the enslaved blacks saw others or saw themselves, the unconscious automatic response to that sight was to be disgrace, anger, and disgust. And so the white slave masters, along with the white philosophers, the white scientists, the white religious leaders, and so forth, they did a great job with accomplishing this, right? A phenomenal job, if you ask me. And so over the years, this self-hate has been passed on generation to generation to generation. And what it does is it takes on various forms in the ever-changing society. And so one of the forms of self-hate is expressed in the pressing and perming of the hair. And we've talked about this before, and we're going to continue talking about it, right? Because it's that serious. And so many women, they'll give all sorts of reasons as to why they do this. But the root reason, right? The root that's underneath all the other reasons is self-hate, right? And the desire to look like something that they're not. And to me, this has always been strange growing up, right? This is one thing that I've never seen my mother do to her own hair, right? Even back in the 80s, when she was in the Marine Corps, she wore a short, compact, natural hairstyle, right? And whenever she grew it out, she would always keep it in twist, right? But she never permed it or pressed it. And her mom, my grandmother, she was like that too, right? As far as I can remember. And so what I do is I encourage women who are listening, right, to wear their natural hair, which to me is a symbolic representation of someone who has a certain level of respect for themselves in today's society, right? And it signals that the woman is comfortable in her own skin, which is respectable. And on top of that, it also paints a positive image for the next generation of girls who have that same type of hair, right? We understand that. And so that's how you can start transitioning away from the black mindset that was inherited. Now understand this, even with the positive image for the youth that this will give and the higher self-respect that natural hair expresses on a woman, there are still a large group of black women that could care less about this, right? They are going to continue straightening their hair and putting as much perm as necessary because that's what makes them feel good about themselves, right? That's their dominant desire, and they can care less about anything that has to do with creating a positive self-image for the youth and the next generation. They care more about creating a hot girl image for going to the club, right? And understand they have every right to do so, right? We're not taking that away. But as a result, they can't be saved. And a lot of them, they'll be the main ones talking about fighting against white supremacy, but they're also the main ones that are upholding white beauty standards, right? And so I'm trying to figure out, how does this make sense to anybody? How, right? I can't understand it, but maybe some people can. But this is part of the self-hate, and only a few have a desire to escape from these grips. Now, how does self-hate find expression in the black males? Have you ever walked past a black man and then he stares at you with this menacing look? If so, That's the manifestation of self-hate. If you look anything similar to him, the reason why he's looking at you that way is because he sees a similar version of himself right in front of his eyes. And since he already hates himself, he feels obligated to hate you too, right? And in these circumstances, you have to be very careful on how you respond, because he's looking for any reason to start problems, right? Any reason. And a lot of the times, these types of people don't have anything to lose, which is why gangs are so appealing to a lot of the black youth, right? It's an opportunity to project that hate that they have for themselves upon other people, right? And on top of that, they get recognition for doing that, right? From their gangs. And so they become accustomed to living in the world that they're comfortable in, right? And many of them, they have no desire to change anything about their lives, right? Because they've already chosen the life that they want to live. Understand, people have different desires in their own independent life, and you can't save all of them. You may be able to save a few that come from that world, right? The ones who desire to change, but the ones who really love that lifestyle, there's no chance of them being saved today, right? Now, another area where self-hate along with degeneracy is promoted is in the music produced in the minds of certain black people, right? Now, have you ever witnessed any people produce so much content promoting their own destruction, right? How many songs are created describing the killing and the robbing of an N-word, right? Or sleeping with someone's wife. That type of degenerate, self-destructing, self-defeating type of ideas being pushed out into the world. Now, one thing that I have to admit is that when I was younger, I used to rap too, right? And I used to talk about a lot of this foolishness as well. But I eventually climbed out of that pit and I stopped making and listening to that type of music, right? Altogether, right? I don't have any desire to plant those types of seed in my mind, right? And so the question is it possible to stop each or even just the majority of all the people from making that type of music, right? And putting that out into the world? The answer is no, right? Because there's too much money out there to be made, and there's no shortage of black people who are willing to do just about anything to make money, right? And what about getting the majority of blacks to stop listening and supporting that type of music? How realistic do you really think that is, right? It's not very realistic, which goes back to the point on why it's impossible to save most black people today. Most blacks have gone way too deep down the path of the pit. But understand, there's still some who have a chance to climb out, which is who these videos are made for. And so now, I want you to listen up closely, because this next path coming out of the pit is by far the most difficult to escape. If you thought the black identity, the self-hate of straightening of the hair, the violence, and the degenerate music were difficult to overcome, then I'm here to tell you that they pale in comparison with this next one. And this next one is organized religion, right? And more specifically, the simplistic Western version of religion, right? The one that was passed on to the slaves, right? There was a reason that this version was given to the slaves, and that's because it yields very little power and possibility to empower people, right? It didn't do it back then, and it still doesn't do it today, which is why blacks in America, they believe in more Jesus than anyone else. They attend churches more than anyone else, but they're doing worse than everyone else. You have to think about that, right? How does that make sense one bit? If Christianity, as practiced by blacks, right, is supposed to be the truth and is supposed to be that which comes from God, how is it that the most dangerous neighborhoods, the people who have the highest rate of criminal activity, the people who have the highest ratio of imprisonment, the people who statistically have the worst health in the country, the people who have the highest number of single parent households, the people who are at the bottom of society in America are the people who have more Jesus than everyone else in America? Now, how is this possible, right? Something isn't adding up, right? The 1 + 1 is not equaling the 2. It's equaling something else. But the reality may be too hard to accept for many people, right? Because it's only meant for the few. And the reality is, Jesus and religion, as understood by most blacks in America today, It's not what they think it is. It's not what they think it is. And that's why it has not fixed any of these major problems that black people experience in America, right? And if it's not fixing those problems, then it's really a waste of time, right? That's the reality. And blacks, what they're doing is they're going around and around on the hamster wheel, right? Repeating the same cycles that have continuously shown to not work. And this should be obvious to any critically thinking person, right? That the reason that the European colonizers went around conquering people and immediately indoctrinating them with their version of religion is because they understood that that version that they were giving people didn't have hardly any power. It didn't have hardly any power at all, right? I mean, you just have to think the slightest bit about it. But how much power is really in a doctrine that says wait on the Lord Jesus to return for your life to improve, or wait until you die until you receive a reward in heaven, right? That is not going to give much power in anyone who receives that. And so the people who were indoctrinating people with these religious ideas, they didn't believe in this themselves, right? Because they weren't waiting for any Jesus or for any afterlife to happen before they improved their lives, right? But they were selling these ideas to everyone else. Because if it did work and if it had real power, the colonizers and the enslavers, they would have never taught that to the people that they were enslaving. Think about that, the simple logic behind that. And as obvious as this is, most blacks today are too far trapped in this pit to see the light, right? And that's why they were going to continue to repeat these cycles. Those people can't be saved. And so the religious pit is too deep and it takes too much energy and mental effort for them to climb out of it. So they're going to choose to remain in it. And so that's the deal with religion and the pit that people have fallen into. Now, the next pit that most blacks are not going to climb out of today is materialism. And materialism is placing a higher value on material possessions and physical objects than the inner qualities and inner character traits of a person, right? Most blacks are too concerned about the clothes that they buy rather than the qualities that they develop in the inner person, right? They're more concerned about the makeup that they wear on the outside than what makes them up in the inside. And all of this is just an attempt to escape from the inner work that still has to be done, right? And when people wonder why they end up in the same miserable relationships and why it is that they keep attracting the same type of woman and the same type of man, that's life communicating with you that there's still some inner work that needs to be done. That's the cosmic correction or the cosmic butt whooping or the cosmic spanking, right? Communicating with you in the way that it communicates with the person that it's trying to talk to. And so the question is, who's going to be the one that does the inner work, right? Who's going to be the one to turn the caterpillar of black consciousness into the butterfly of a new consciousness? And so that's the question. And the answer is all have the ability to do so. But the reality is the majority will not, right? Because they don't want to do so, which is why it's impossible to save most black people today. Now understand, from my personal estimate, there are only about 9% of blacks in America that are ready to move on to the next phase, right? The actual number could be higher or it could be lower, right? But the point that I'm making is that most are not ready, right? Most are not ready. But the few that are, those are the people who have been curious and consciously questioning their inherited beliefs and the inherited ideas and their inherited habits that have not been working for them. And they have been genuinely seeking answers and solutions. And so one thing that has to be understood is that to fix these problems and to save yourself, you have to be willing to do things that may initially be uncomfortable doing, right? You have to make the decision to face the unknown, right? So you can be a conscious participant in the shaping of your own life. The rest of the people, what's going to happen to them is they're going to be unconsciously moved all about, right, by the environment, and their lives are going to continue to be at the mercy of the external circumstances that they face. the external things, right? They're not going to have any control of it. The slaves were the same way, right? They didn't have any choice as to how they ended up, right? With the types of ideas, beliefs, the habits, the culture, and the character traits that they developed, right? Not much choice in how they developed that. These were all strategically forced upon them, right? And what they developed during that time, it set their descendants up down on a path that was full of problems in the future, right? And what we have to recognize for today is that nobody is going to force anyone to do any climbing out of the pit that people had fallen into in the past times. The people living today, what has to happen is they have to freely choose to climb out of the pit from their own will and volition. And so that's one of the differences between the 91% who are going to stay enslaved and the 9% of people who are going to climb out and become free. And so I want you to really think about that, right? And so hopefully this video here has been helpful and giving you some light to help you climb just one more rung up the ladder to get out of the pit. And so I want to genuinely thank you for watching all the way into the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.